So we're in Leviticus chapter 1 again. And how about that? We've read Leviticus all month, and none of us turned into stone. Pretty neat, huh? I tell you. Anyways, I humor myself, and sometimes it doesn't translate well, so I have to know when to just laugh quietly by myself and when to actually explain the joke. Now's the time for me to just move on. It's not going to be funny if I say it. Last week we looked at the idea that nobody can approach God for us. We have to approach God for ourselves. Well, today we're going to kind of point out that really one of the last things about Leviticus 1 that I want to really focus on, and that's what is the point of these things? We've read through the chapter, but really, what is the point of it? We've read about how he says to lay the hand on the animal. We've read all these different things, and then it being burned up and it being a food offering to the Lord, and how he's pleased. What does that mean? And we're going to focus on that specifically today. And one thing that's very interesting about the law, and people oftentimes miss this because we try to get through the law as fast as we can. But one thing that's very evident in the law is it'll make a comment, and then it'll explain the comment. You know what I mean? So like, for instance, it'll say in Exodus, do not worship any gods besides me. And then it'll say later in the law, don't trim the edges of your beard, which is a way that people were worshiping other gods. Don't mark your bodies for the dead, which is a way people were worshiping other gods. So it has like this principle, don't worship other gods, and then he has a bunch of applications in case the Israelites missed what he was saying. This chapter 1 also does the exact same thing. Let's start in verse 2. Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when any of you brings an offering to the Lord from the livestock, you may bring your offering from the herd or the flock. Now, I'm not going to read the whole chapter because it repeats itself 3 different times. If it's from the herd or the flock or a bird. Okay, so just kind of roll with it there, okay? And going to verse 3, it says, if his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he is to bring an unblemished male. And then he says this, he will bring it to the entrance, and he's going to give a purpose statement here. He will bring it to the entrance to the tent of meeting so that he may be accepted by the Lord. And in verse 4, it's going to say the same thing, and we'll back up to verse 3, but just in verse 4, it says, he is to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering so it can be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. So if you look, both of these sections are giving action and then kind of explanation to the action. So in hopping back to verse 3 where it says, he will bring it to the entrance to the tent of meeting so that he may be accepted by the Lord. What he's saying here is you bring it to God. Bring it where God is. Because remember, the whole point of the tabernacle was that God was dwelling with his people. He was there. So why are they bringing it there? Because that's where God is. Bring it to where God is. And so the obvious idea of being there, it's going to be accepted if you bring it to him. Right? Like, let's say, okay, I have a gift, okay, for my wife. This is a gift for you. Come and get it. See what I mean? That's the same kind of basic idea here. The tabernacle was a place where he was, so you were bringing it to the tabernacle, and he would accept you. And obviously the idea is there being, hey, obey and draw near. So then you get to verse 4, and he says, he is to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering. Okay, you lay your hand on it, so it can be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. Sorry, when I did that, I was thinking of How to Train Your Dragon, where he's nobody. Did you guys ever see that movie? Sorry, woo, back on track, talking about the law. I'm here, I'm present. So in verse 4 here, one of the biggest misconception I think about the sacrifices, and I mentioned this last week, is the idea that every single sacrifice, you just kind of ignore it and say Jesus. Because not every single sacrifice was for the sake of sin. So right along with that is the idea that, every single time that they do anything like putting their hand on it, it must be somehow transferring the sin to the animal. Because that makes sense. Because if Jesus is the perfect sacrifice, that would mean we'd have to say every sacrifice is that, so then I'm transferring my sin to the animal. The problem is that the burnt offering isn't for sin. It's my jam. So you have this, it's not transferring sin because this sacrifice isn't for sin. The idea behind laying your hand on it was a simple way of you're identifying the animal, you're identifying ownership with it, you're kind of, what's the right word? there's a word that I'm searching for, and I can't think of what it is, so I'm just going to move on. Kind of like identifying yourself with the animal, and then I'm saying that you're the owner of it, and you're transferring ownership to God. I'm transferring, this is mine. I'm admitting publicly this is mine. I'm transferring this. You are all my witness. This is now God's. I'm giving it to God. So obviously, no take-backs. No, you can't do that. So it's transferring. So then that brings us to a very important question that I think sometimes we see the end of the story, right? The whole Jesus bit, right? So we go into the Old Testament, and sometimes we miss what's being said because we rush to understand things with the revelation of Jesus. And specifically what I'm talking about here is it says, so it can be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. Now, once again, we have the idea of atonement from the New Testament, right? That's what we have up here. But you have to realize this is before the law. Before Jesus. You can't attribute meaning in the ancient text to what its fulfillment became later. Then you're going to miss what the whole main point of it is. So in this context, the word atonement isn't the way you're thinking of. It's more of purification or a purging of evil. And the idea is this. God is holy, right? The people, not holy. And so they're coming to bring their sacrifice, which is also not holy, except that it's been dedicated to God, but the animal itself is not. So then they come and bring it to the altar, which is holy. So you have, in the offering, you have this clash of holy with profane. And I brought this up last week. See, because the minute that the animal was dead, it was no longer clean, but the only way to offer sacrifice was for it to be dead, so a little bit of a issue there. Okay? So then when the priest came in contact with the dead animal, they were also unclean. So the whole point of this is you're purifying, you're purging the evil, you're keeping the altar clean, and you're also purging the evil from yourself. It's kind of like this. It acts as like the intermediary that the priest is offering. You can think of it as kind of like a halfway point. So it was burned on his behalf to purge the evil and keep the altar clean. Okay, all right. So the main focus here is obviously that God was holy and his space had to be kept holy. That fits. So now we can hop down to verse 9 because we looked at all the other verses. And verse 9 is going to be repeated 3 different times in the chapter, so we're not going to read all 3 times, but just, use your imagination. You can kind of fill in the blanks. Or if you want to just take a quick few minutes and read it in your Bible. You get all the animal except the skin. All the animal except the skin is burned completely on the altar. So what happens to the skin? Well, I guess you keep it. It doesn't really matter. It just doesn't get on the altar. And you might say, now hold on. I remember last week because I was paying attention. Or 2 weeks ago, how in the world they took off the skin, then why did they have to wash off the legs? Well, because, and most of you actually probably already know this, when you are skinning an animal, you don't go the whole way down the animal, right? Like typically on a cow, for instance, you go kind of around here somewhere. You know what I mean? So you would still have some of the skin left on the animal's leg. If you guys have ever butchered a chicken, something similar happens. You just kind of you defeather it, but you still got them scrawny little legs looking all ugly. So you burn all of it except for the skin, and that takes us to verse 9. The offerer is to wash its entrails and legs with water. Then the priest will burn all of it on the altar as a burnt offering. And here we're going to get to the explanation of the thing. Okay, this is the meaning in the thing here. A food offering, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Okay, so let's kind of go through this, okay? First thing to point out, we look at the law as boring. Understandable. I'm not too excited about the idea of going out and slaughtering it. I totally get it. But there's something very important here before we take it apart. Focus on this. A pleasing aroma to the Lord. It didn't just say he would accept it. It wouldn't just say he would grudgingly go along with it. Rather, this is something that's going to cause God joy. He's pleased with it. He enjoys what is happening. How in the world could it? Well, now hold on. We'll come back to that idea. I just want to. Okay. Now let's kind of contrast this with the ancient Near East, which is the world around Israel way back then. And there are at least 2 huge differences between the ancient Near East and the law in this aspect. There's lots more, but I mean in this specific spot. First off, in the ancient Near East, gods actually ate the sacrifice. The food literally sustained them. They were, in a way, dependent on their worshipers. But what we see in the law is that's not what's happening. Now, God is using human terms. He's using common terms of the day so that they can understand. But it never actually says once that God ate it, does it? Let's look back at verse 9. A food offering, that's using the language from the neighboring Israel, and everybody who was listening to the law would understand what that part meant. And then it doesn't go on to say anything about God actually eating it. A pleasing aroma to the Lord, not a pleasing meal to the Lord. See, there's something very significant that's happening in this wording. Whereas the gods had to be sustained through the worshipers, God didn't. He's using common terms to describe what's happening. You are giving me a burnt offering, and I'm accepting it from you. And it is pleasing to me. I'm not eating it. And he's going to get to that. We're going to talk, just put a pin in that. We're going to look at a specific verse that talks about that. But the main idea here is that it pleased God. The second huge difference, and actually before we get to the second difference, I wanted to read this. This is from the ancient Near Eastern text, specifically documents 207 to 10. It's here on the screen. And I've just taken out an excerpt. This is a Hittite document, which was kind of in the area. Not important. About the mid-13th century BC. So for those of you who are historian buffs, this is right around the same time, well, a little bit after Moses has taken the people of Israel to the Promised Land. Look what it says. If an ox is driven up to the god as food. Okay, now let's keep further down. This is probably about 2 paragraphs down or so. And thus take it away from the god and withhold it from his mouth. This vocabulary is never used in the law to describe what's happening with the sacrifices. But if you see, in the ancient world, it was very much so the common theme. So now we can get to the second huge major difference between the ancient Near East and the law. In the ancient world, for lack of, I'm going to summarize some ideas, and you can't really point to one specific ancient text because it's kind of like an overriding theme or an idea that they shared. But they had this idea that you were buying the God's blessings. So if something, for instance, let's say you got a bad omen, right? Like you looked outside and there was a crow outside and you're like, it's an evil omen. So you would go and you would recite this thing precisely, and you would appeal to the God by offering so-and-so, and then he just kind of was obligated to answer you because you went through all the right motions. You know? But right here, what we see from the law, that's really not what's going on. God had already bought them. In fact, the whole point of Exodus is their redemption by God. And in Exodus chapter 15, in case the people of Israel missed it, we get to chapter 15, and Moses specifically says, you who bought the people. Specifically mentions that. And so then you get further on into Exodus, and you see God erecting his house, his throne room in the middle of the people, the tabernacle. And so he's already dwelling with them, and he already gave them a contract. You guys have already, we're in Joshua now or something? So you already read through Exodus where he makes a contract, a legal document with the people of Israel. He did all that before Leviticus. So they're already in contract with them. Them doing this is not buying anything from God. So the 3 specific verses or sets of verses that I think really get these points across. The first one's from Isaiah chapter 1. What are all your sacrifices to me, asked the Lord? I have had enough of burnt offerings and rams and the fat of well-fed cattle. I have no desire for the blood of bulls, lambs, or male goats. This is before Jesus ever came. He already found fault with the sacrifice before Jesus ever came. When you come to appear before me, who requires this from you, this trampling of my courts? Stop bringing useless offerings. See, what they're trying to do is, I'm going to buy you off. I'm going to live however I want, but then I'm going to offer a sacrifice, and we're all going to be good. And that's just not what the law was intended for. And you see people do this nowadays with church, too. You know, I'm going to go to church, and I'm going to be good with God. I'll even pay tithes. but don't tell me how to live my life. Stop bringing useless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. New moons and Sabbaths and the calling of solemn assemblies. I cannot stand iniquity with a festival. I hate your new moons and prescribed festivals. They have become a burden to me. I am tired of putting up with them. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I will refuse to look at you. He's not even going to answer their prayers. Even if you offer countless prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are covered with blood. See, it wasn't about the sacrifice itself. It was about the heart. All the way back in Leviticus. And this prophecy was given in the 700s BC. This is not a later addition that people just came up to ease their conscience. This was all the way back in the 700s. But let's go 200 years before that. Psalm chapter 50, 200 years before that prophecy. For every animal of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. See, he already owned the sacrifice. Them offering it to him didn't change anything. They couldn't buy God off because he already owned it. He owned them. There's no offer here. I know every bird of the mountains and the creature of the field, they're mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you. For the world and everything in it is mine. Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats? This is a rhetorical question, the answer being obvious, no. God does not actually eat the blood. He does not actually. So right here, from the 900s, and the law was given in the 1400s, so this isn't some later addition. This is something that they had the idea from the get-go. Do I offer a thanksgiving sacrifice to God and pay your vows to the Most High? Call on me in a day of trouble. I will rescue you, and you will honor me. Not about your sacrifices. It's about the heart. Well, let's go another 100 years earlier to really a dark time in Israelite history, really dark time, to something that one of the very last judge of Israel said. This is from 1 Samuel 15. Then Samuel said, does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? Look, to obey is better than sacrifice. To pay attention is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and defiance is like wickedness and idolatry. Look how good we're doing. Oh, no. It's about the heart. And you're not doing too good. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. So right there, we see three different examples over the span of, let's count, over 300 years here, where he's talking about exactly what I've just been talking about. So the one thing that kind of sticks out to me, and I'm sure some of you guys might have the history to know this. Well, let's start with this. Has anybody traveled to places like India or Nepal or anything like that? No? Okay. So in places where they do animal sacrifices still, there's something that you have to smell to believe it, and this smells gross. This thing that he's talking about here, about the altar, it smells gross. I have had the misfortune of smelling an animal burned like this. It's gross. It's not pleasant. So how can God possibly say that it was a pleasing aroma? Well, because God is talking about the faith that it was done with. When they offered this animal in faith, it was pleasing to God. See, the animal in itself didn't really do anything, but God accepted it on their behalf. He accepted it from the position of faith. So God is not indebted. He's not bribed. We don't earn it or have to try to earn it. Okay, so then what is the purpose of the burnt offering? We've spent a month looking at one chapter, one type of the 5 sacrifices. So what on earth is the good of it? Well, the main purpose of a burnt offering was to bring a request to God. So if you remember back in Genesis where Abraham is about to, his son, remember? He got tired of him lipping off. No, I'm just kidding. He's about to offer up Isaac on the altar. You remember that? That would have been a burnt offering. Literally. That's not funny, Dad. Okay, maybe a little bit funny. And the main idea is to bring a request. So a good example would be maybe you're asking for victory or for purification or these different things. So think about this. I'm going to war with so-and-so. I want God to bless it. I want to win. So I'm going to offer a burnt offering to God. and then I'm going to offer my prayer. Now, in the law, we have a lot of different complexities that come into the equation as to why God might not answer that request. But in the pagan worship of the day, they didn't have so many. It was just kind of like, well, you didn't offer enough bulls, I guess. And so the main idea, I guess, from this is that you can really draw is that God is pleased when we draw near. He enjoys it. This is specifically how this applies to us today. God enjoys it when we draw near. Sometimes we go through just the motions, we get bored with these things. Sometimes we feel bad because I'm trying to read my Bible, I'm just not into it. Well, I'm trying to pray, I just don't have the right words. Well, I'm coming to church, but it's kind of boring. I'd rather be at home sleeping or watching a game or whatever. But when we offer sacrifices to God, even if we're having a hard time offering the sacrifice, God enjoys it. God is pleased with our efforts. He's not that boss that doesn't think that anything you do is good enough. That's not God. He is pleased when we draw near. And unfortunately, we get into ruts of either in our worship, we hit a spiral in our worship. We get into ruts where either we're living in sin or we've been hurt or we've failed too many times. And so we go through this same predictable spiral in our worship. And the first stage of the spiral is self-doubt. And you might say, well, I'm not supposed to believe myself. I didn't say believe in yourself. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm more talking about like this. Am I good enough to worship God? Have you ever been there? Yeah, I've messed it too many times. God's not going to hear my prayer. He's not even interested in what I have to say. I'm sorry, God. I'll never do it again. We try to work ourselves up into maybe I can be a good enough person. If you've ever dealt with addictive behaviors, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This kind of stuff happens all the time, and you actually hear it all the time. And the problem is, it's that this attitude deteriorates faith in God. Because you start seeing God as untouchable in the aspect, and hear what I'm saying, in the aspect that he's too good for you and he doesn't want anything to do with you. So then if you carry this mindset, you're not going to worship him because you're going to think, I'm the lowest of worms. God doesn't care if I worship him. I'm insignificant. When the whole time God is saying, I am pleased with your worship. I'm pleased. And I think that's hard because we go to the extremes, especially in our culture. We either worship ourselves or we hate ourselves. You know what I mean? And it's not really about God. It's more about our own personal attitude. So we go through this self-doubt. Am I good enough? I don't matter. God couldn't possibly love me. I've messed up too many times. Well, you'd be surprised how many times I hear this one. My dad doesn't even love me. I hear that one all the time. How in the world could God accept me when my mom doesn't? Everybody says I'm not good enough. How could God? And you get stuck into this rut, and you think there's no way out of it because you're in a hole. And it is a hard place to be in because no words will suffice. You can't have the perfect words as a pastor. You see their hurt, and it cripples you. But if you only knew God and what he really thinks of you. Imagine the significance, and sometimes we forget this, the significance of God in all of his glory. Coming down for us. The Bible says that this is how we know what love is. And God says very specifically in the law, I am pleased with it. But after we get through self-doubt, we turn the corner to a very ugly place, and this place is called apathy. Apathy looks something like this. We get tired of trying. What's the point? Doesn't matter. Just doesn't matter. I used to do this in the church, or I used to be this, or I used to be known as this, or this is how I used to live my life. But those days are behind me. It doesn't really matter anymore. And now I just want to come, I want to go through the motions, and I want to go home. I want everybody to just leave me alone. Because it just doesn't even matter. Why even try? And then once apathy has taken root, we turn the corner again. And we get to an even worse place called bitterness. Bitterness is terrible because it changes our perception of God, ourselves, and everyone around us. And we take that into our life. And it's really hard to tell people about Jesus when you're stuck in the throes of bitterness. Oh, it's hard. And you can tell if your heart's bitter by the way that you're acting. Do you throw people away? Do you give up on people? Are you patient with people, or you just forget about it? In your marriage, is it starting to cause problems? In your kids' lives, in your grandkids' lives, is it starting to cause problems? Are you more okay with just leaving the church in total? I'm never going to go to church again. Than you are just going through the motions. Because we get in a place, I'm honestly, if my legs stopped working and I couldn't go to church anymore, oh well. You know, just why even mess with that? And we're okay with God being pleased with us and blessing us, but we don't want to have to actually be inconvenienced. We're just so not into it anymore. And some other things that happen in this stage, a very ugly place to be in. We start mistreating our spouse, and it's okay. We have all kinds of reasons why it's okay to mistreat our spouse. We start neglecting our kids, and that's okay because it doesn't matter. We start serving ourselves. Our money is all about us. Our time is all about us. Every little thing that people say is an inconvenience. We start talking bad about our boss or about our job or about the pastor or about the church or whatever. We just are always a fountain of negativity because from the heart comes out the mouth. And we think, oh, it's fine. Nobody knows. People know. Having bitterness is like having bad breath. Everybody knows but you. Everybody knows. And so this is unfortunately the spiral that comes. So then what is the cure? Well, it'd be easy to just say Jesus and move on, but it gets a little more complicated than that. You have to answer the mental battle with Scripture. And you have to retrain yourself. And you have to admit that you were wrong. And you have to ask people to forgive you. And all those things put together is extremely uncomfortable. None of us want to say, I was wrong. Please forgive me. Oh, my goodness. Oof. What an ugly thing, especially when you have to do it with somebody who knows you, like your spouse. You know what I mean? If you do it in front of a group of people, like, I did not have sexual relations with that woman. Yeah, well, you know, that's something. But when it's somebody who actually knows you, you know what I mean? That gets awkward. And but you have to really own up to it because bitterness doesn't go away, apathy doesn't go away, self-doubt doesn't just stop. You have to start actively addressing with Scripture. Am I good enough? It doesn't really matter because Jesus is good enough and He's not going to throw me away. I'm just tired of trying. What's the point? The point is that we've been redeemed and our life is not our own. Well, I guess it just doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter how I treat people. No, it does matter. True religion is how we treat people, not having all the answers. The thing isn't the problem. If you notice this, the attitude is. And let's get ready to wrap things up here. God, long story short here, guys, God is waiting eagerly, literally waiting eagerly to accept you. And this applies whether you're a Christian or not. If you're a Christian, He's already promised to accept all who believe in Jesus. You don't have to worry about that self-doubt. Come to God. And if you're not a Christian, He is literally waiting to forgive you. He's not that person who's standing over you saying, you messed up, I don't care, get out. He's the person who's saying, whenever you're ready. Whenever you're ready. He's not upset. He's waiting. I was walking through the halls this week and just praying. And I just really felt God impress on my heart. I'm just waiting to move in people's lives. I'm just waiting. Eagerly. God, you're not an inconvenience to God. He wants you to draw near. He's not far off. He's come near to us. He's just waiting to accept you, and He's waiting to bless you. Please join me in prayer. I want to talk for just a minute. Wherever you find yourself, whether it's self-doubt or apathy or bitterness, trust in what God said. He knows where you are. He knew you'd be here. It's not about how you feel. It's about the truth of what he said. And at some point, you have to allow how you feel to take a second seat to what God said. And I got to try and figure out how I feel, and I got to figure out my thinking. I got to get my head clean. What a wasted effort. You're never going to get there. You're always going to be working on it and never arriving. It's not about how you feel. It's not about the way you just feel wrong and off. It's what God said. So I want to talk to those who you're in a place where your faith is weak. You're stuck in that hole that I was talking about. Don't give up just yet. Don't give up just yet. God is not just waiting, he's eagerly waiting to accept you. Don't give up just yet. Lord, I pray that you would touch hearts right now. You see those who are hurting. You see those who are just in a place of they're done. If you need God to touch your heart, just start asking now. If you find yourself in a place where you just don't care anymore, you've seen too much, you've done too much, God is waiting eagerly. I just want to give just a few minutes here because I feel like God's trying to talk to people's hearts. If I'm wrong, we're not out anything. God, that you would move in people's hearts. Lord, you see those who are suffering, God. If you need prayer, you're just stuck. If you just need prayer, come up to the front. We'll pray for you. I want to give some time. We're not trying to call you out. We just want to see God move in you. I don't want to see you leave here and go back to your life when the whole time you could have encountered God. If you only knew. If you only knew the goodness of God for yourself. It doesn't matter what people think. If you need prayer, just come up and I'll pray for you. I want to give you a couple minutes. God has not given up on you. God has not given up on you. It doesn't matter if you feel like your dad's given up on you. If it feels like your boss or your mom gave up on you. It doesn't matter if you feel like your spouse gave up on you. God has not given up on you. And he is waiting eagerly. He wants to do a work in you like nothing you've ever seen. We'll just give a couple more minutes. I don't want to belabor the point. God, we're trusting in you. We're trusting in you, God. If I could ask the church to come forward and pray for these. We're all going to just pray together. If you mind, please stand up and come join us at the front over here. And I'm going to wait until you stand up and come to the front, so it's going to get awkward.